Alright, welcome to the third video on the topic of inflation, where we will be talking about the effects of inflation. Why we should care. Why does it matter if prices rise? Right? Now, at first that might sound like a ridiculous question. Of course it matters if prices rise because things get more expensive and I have to spend more money at the grocery store and I don't have more money. But wait, why don't you have more money? Remember what I said in the second video on inflation. If we simply took all prices, all dollar amounts, all money everywhere in the US economy, and added a zero at the end of all the numbers, the money in your pocket has an extra zero on it. Your next paycheck has an extra zero at the end of it. All the prices at the grocery store have an extra zero at the end of it, and your rent and everything else also has an extra zero at the end of it. In other words, if everything became 10 times more expensive, if all money, if all dollar amounts and all prices and wages and rents and everything became 10 times higher, all at the same time, overnight, then nothing would happen. Everything would be 10 times more expensive, but you would have 10 times more money. Nothing would happen. Everything would effectively stay the same. Therefore, the thing to remember is that the reason, in fact, the only reason why inflation matters is because prices do not all rise in lockstep at the same time to the same degree. Inflation is not just adding a zero at the end of everything. If it were, it would not matter. Inflation matters because, and only because, prices rise at different speeds. Some rise faster, some rise slower. Okay, and that brings us to the first effect of inflation, which is called redistribution of purchasing power. Now, you might see that word redistribution and think that it has something to do with taxes or government spending or the idea of redistribution of wealth. No, I mean, it's connected. It's in the sense that it's a similar concept, vaguely, but it's not connected to taxes or government spending or anything like that. It's redistribution of purchasing power, in the sense that as a result of inflation, essentially some people get more bang for their buck. Some people can buy more things than they used to be able to, and other people can buy fewer things than they used to be able to. Some people get less bang for their buck, as it were. That's what we mean by redistribution of purchasing power. Nobody actually gains or loses any money or anything physical. It's just people gain or lose the ability to buy more stuff. You know, people are either able to buy more things than they thought they would be, or they're less able to buy things. They're able to buy fewer things than they thought they would be. So let's start with the obvious. Wage earners lose out from inflation. In fact, not just wage earners, but anybody who has any kind of fixed or semi-fixed income, in other words, most people, they encounter this issue that the prices of consumer goods, the prices of things that you buy, go up faster and earlier than your wage increases. Wages increase with inflation too, but after a certain lag. You know, wages don't go up every day or every week or even every month. Usually you get an adjustment every year, sometimes not even that. So wages go up, but slower or with a lag compared to inflation, compared to the increase in prices for consumer goods. So wage earners lose out from inflation. But this is not a net loss for society. Inflation does not destroy value. It does not destroy wealth. It does not make purchasing power just disappear into thin air. For every loss, for every person that suffers from inflation in some way, there's somebody else who has something to gain. That's why we call this redistribution of purchasing power, right? It's not just that your purchasing power disappears into thin air. No, somebody has something to gain from your loss. And it's usually pretty straightforward. Like, for example, wage earners lose. What do they lose? Well, they lose the fact that they lose because wages go up slower than the prices of consumer goods, so there's a certain lag. So if inflation occurs, then the amount of stuff that you can buy with your wage is less than you thought, or less than you used to be able to buy. Okay, so who stands to gain from that? Well, your employer. companies. Employers win because if you can delay increasing your workers' wages, then that's effectively the same as a pay cut. And we talked last week in the unemployment chapter about how pay cuts are almost taboo. For a variety of reasons, companies do not generally cut wages, but they can neglect to increase them. And in fact, they often do neglect to increase wages. And if inflation is occurring, then neglecting to increase a wage is effectively the same as cutting the wage, because the wage is being cut in real terms by the decline of purchasing power. So companies stand to gain from inflation. Employers stand to gain from inflation. Specifically, they stand to gain by delaying wage rises, but by delaying wage increases. So employers win, wage earners lose. But we're not done with fixed or semi-fixed incomes just yet. Wages are not really fixed. They're semi-fixed incomes. That is to say, they go up, but they go up slowly and usually only once or twice a year. They're sticky, as we said last week. But there are other incomes that are actually fixed, that do not go up at all, ever. And people on those incomes stand to lose a lot from inflation, because if inflation is occurring and you're on an actual fixed income that just will not go up, you're not going to get a raise ever, because raises don't happen for your income, then inflation is a very, very bad thing. Who has that sort of income? People on pensions. The textbook talks about this. People on fixed pensions, pensioners, for example. So pensioners lose because pensions are fixed incomes. People who have retired on a defined benefit pension lose out from inflation. Who stands to gain something from that? Again, whoever is paying their pension stands to gain from that, usually the company that they worked for. So again, employers win because, if you never have to give, if you never have to increase a pension, then and inflation is occurring, then in effect, in practice, what's happening is that the pension is slowly declining. So you are effectively paying less and less over time. Who else stands to win or lose? Well, suppose you've borrowed some money from a bank or from anyone else. And of course you have to pay it back. Suppose you've borrowed $10,000 and you have to pay it back. But as you pay it back, if inflation is occurring, then the $10,000 that you've paid back, by the time you've paid it back, is worth less, its purchasing power is less than the $10,000 that you borrowed some years ago in the first place. So inflation benefits borrowers. Ordinary people can benefit from inflation. We usually think of ordinary people as being hurt by inflation because of, they're wage earners or they have pensions or other things like that. But in your capacity as a borrower, to the extent that you borrowed money, you can actually stand to gain from inflation, because the money that you pay back, if inflation is occurring, then the money that you pay back will be worth less in real terms than the money that you borrowed in the first place. The money that you pay back will have less purchasing power. So in effect, you're paying back less. Of course, you're also paying back an interest. So, you borrowed $10,000, you're not going to pay back $10,000, you're going to pay back like $15,000 once all the interest is added up. But even so, inflation is sort of like taking the edge off a little bit. Because of inflation, that interest isn't as big as it looks. Like, it looks like you have to pay back $15,000, but in effect, the $15,000 that you're paying back, the purchasing power of that isn't quite as big as it would have been, at the start when you originally borrowed your money. So, yeah, interest rates means that because of the existence of interest rates, you're still going to end up paying more than you borrowed, but inflation takes the edge off a little bit. So, borrowers stand to win, stand to gain something from inflation. And of course, the flip side of that is lenders lose. Whoever issued that loan, a bank, for example, or whatever other institution, is going to get paid back in terms of purchasing power less than it expects, or less than the number would seem to indicate. Those $15,000 that it gets at the end are going to be less than they're going to be worth less in terms of purchasing power than they would have been a few years earlier. So lenders, the amount of money that you get back from your borrowers is getting whittled down. Its purchasing power, its real usefulness is getting whittled down by inflation. So as a lender, as a bank, inflation is bad for you. And this, by the way, is the reason why banks hate inflation. Banks are very, very opposed to inflation, and they're one of the strongest pressure groups, interest groups, trying to get the government to keep inflation as low as possible. This is why, because banks are lenders, and lenders tend to lose from inflation. Now, this list can go on. Obviously, anybody who's holding cash, like at home or in a safety deposit box or anywhere else, and not doing anything with it, stands to lose from inflation as well, which can be seen as a positive effect of inflation, as we talked about in the first video, in the sense that by making it so that it's a bad idea to just hold on to cash, inflation gives people a reason to use that money for something, to invest it, to purchase stuff with it, to use it for consumption, to use it for investment. In other words, inflation gives people more of a reason to go out there and contribute to the economy rather than just holding on to their money. So that can be seen as a positive impact. But of course, it also means that if you just hold on to your money, you stand to lose. Its value is slowly getting eroded, whittled down by inflation. So this list can continue. All sorts of different categories of people stand to win something or to lose something from inflation. And of course, the same person can belong to more than one category. You can be a wage earner who also has borrowed a lot of money from the bank. So in that case, inflation hurts you as a wage earner, but benefits you as a borrower. So maybe in the end, the final effect is a wash, and it balances out. Maybe, or maybe not. Maybe it leans more to one direction or the other. The same person can be in more than one of these categories. But these are some examples of the redistribution of purchasing power effects that we get from inflation. Again, inflation doesn't redistribute money physically, but it does mean that some people get more bang for their buck, as it were, and some people get less. All right, now let's talk about some of the other effects of inflation on society. There is something that the textbook calls blurred price signals. Now, this refers to the fact that when inflation is occurring, prices are rising, right? So when you look at the price of something and see that it has risen, you can't really know, at least not right away, not without doing a lot of research, you can't know why it has risen. Has it risen because that thing is genuinely more valuable or more scarce, perhaps? Has it risen because that thing is in higher demand? More people are trying to buy it. The demand curve has shifted to the right. Remember, supply-demand graph. So that thing is more in demand now, so therefore the price has gone up. Is it because of that? Is it because there's a problem with supply? Supply curve has shifted to the left. That can also lead to an increase in price. Is it because, say for example, cell phones are getting more expensive? Maybe some of the components for those phones, rare earth metals mined in the sub-Saharan Africa. There's maybe some difficulties with sourcing those components, and therefore cell phones are more expensive. Is it because of that, or is it just because of inflation? In other words, you see a price increasing, and you don't know if the increase is due to real effects. Supply has shifted to the left, or demand has shifted to the right. That could be a reason why a price has increased. Or it could just be simple inflation. You don't know right away. And of course, for a regular consumer, who cares, right? Okay, you go to the supermarket and you see that some things are more expensive. You don't particularly care why they're more expensive. You just get annoyed that they're more expensive. Of course, we all do. So it doesn't really matter for us as consumers why a certain price has increased, whether it's because of inflation or because of some issue with supply or demand. But it does matter for investors, and it does matter for companies. So this thing called blurred price signals basically means that inflation makes things confusing for companies. It makes things confusing for investors. You may see the price of smartphones going up, and you, as an investor, and you might be like, should I invest in that? The price is going. It's a growth industry, or is it just experiencing inflation? Well, the answer is probably a little bit of both. And then the question is, how much of the price increase is due to inflation? How much is due to increased demand or reduced supply? Hard to tell, right? So as an investor, as a company, inflation makes things more difficult. It makes things more blurred. It makes decisions more difficult and therefore potentially more random. And random decisions can lead to bad stuff happening. So yeah, blurred price signals. Because of inflation, you don't necessarily know, as a company, as an investor, if the changes in prices that you're seeing are due to something actually happening with supply and demand, or if they're just due to inflation. And therefore, you can have trouble making good decisions, and you might make bad decisions. Another effect of inflation, very similar, related to this one, difficulties with long-term planning. Now, this one affects consumers just as much as it does investors and companies. It affects everyone. It's simply the fact that as long as inflation is occurring, prices are going up, the more inflation occurs, the less you know in advance what the price of something might be in a year or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10. And this makes it difficult to plan. This makes it difficult to know how much money you should save for the future, or whether you should save money in a bank account or use that money to buy something that's protected from inflation, like a plot of land, for example, or something else that's not money and therefore isn't going to suffer inflation. And that, of course, is a problem that can happen with regular people just as much as with companies. When prices go up, and especially when prices go up at different speeds because of inflation, so you never know which of the many different things is actually going to be more expensive in the future. You know that all prices are going to be somewhat higher, of course, that's what inflation is, but you don't know which one is going to be higher than which other price. So you don't know what items will be more expensive compared to others 10 years from now. And that causes difficulties with long-term planning, whether it's investors planning where to invest, or whether it's consumers planning to save money and buy something in the future, or anyone. And the more inflation we have, the less clear it is what prices will be in the future, and the more difficulties we're going to have with long-term planning. Obviously, if inflation is very high, then you just have absolutely no clue what prices are going to be a few years from now, and you can't really plan for the future at all. On the other hand, if inflation is reasonably low, then you still have a pretty good idea what prices are going to be in the short and medium term at least. So you can plan, of course, not as well as you could plan if there was no inflation at all, but you could plan better. The lower the inflation, the better you can plan for the future. So when we look at all these negative effects, right, we might think that inflation is a terrible thing that should be avoided at all costs. But remember, the flip side of inflation is deflation. And here's a question that I would ask you if this was a class. Which ones of these negative effects of inflation would still happen if we had deflation instead? Well, the answer is all of them. If we had deflation, if prices were going down instead of up, would that make it difficult to plan things in the long term? Sure. Prices would be unstable and unpredictable, just in the opposite direction. It would still cause the exact same difficulties with long-term planning. Deflation still has this problem, causes this problem. Would it blur price signals? You don't know if prices are going down because of deflation or because of something else? Yep. Deflation would cause this problem too. What about the thing that used to be up here, all those winners and losers, different categories of people winning or losing in terms of purchasing power? Well, with deflation, all of that is reversed. Winners become losers and vice versa, but it's still a redistribution of purchasing power. Deflation, prices going down, has all of the same negative consequences as inflation does, and some others on top of that. Namely, the fact that deflation discourages investment and spending and consumption and participating in the economy. So deflation has all the negative consequences of inflation and then some. And that's why we don't want deflation. And since keeping things perfectly balanced on the knife edge between inflation and deflation is basically impossible, since we can't do that, we can't have zero change in the price level, the best that we can do, the best that we can aim for is low inflation. And that is why low inflation is one of the major goals of macroeconomic policy. And with that, we have reached the end of this video, and I will see you next week.